Hi, my name's Rain. I've been running the Fuzz Factory for over 10 years now. I started it in 2014 full time, though I had been making suits since 2011, so I've been doing this a little while. Uh, I traditionally have been making suits out of things like foam as a sculpting method and fur, and I learned from like matrices tutorials and a bunch of other websites and things that I saw. And my background before doing suits was theater. I made sets and props and designed, and I actually taught in colleges as well. I really like that, and it's something that I miss a lot, is that teaching aspect of this, of what I used to do, and it's something I kind of want to explore with the Fuzz Academy. So if you're interested in learning more techniques, technology, how things integrate into fursuit making or even cosplay, this is hopefully going to be a helpful resource for you. Over the last few years, I've seen a boom in technology being used. Things like Nomad Sculpt and Blender for VR chat avatars, and even more recently, a lot of work being done in 3D modeling and printing for fursuits. One of those areas is using TPU, a flexible foam filament, to create different things. And in the last few years, I've really been dying to go into it. It's kind of a daunting subject. There's a lot of pieces that you have to learn before you feel really comfortable with that. And so I'm hoping today to help people get through a problem that I had, which was choosing filaments and learning how they work. If you're like me and you've been making suits for a while, you recognize like making things out of foam. It's the kind of probably the most common way to make suits. Carving it using hot glue and scissors and electric carving knives. And it's pretty great. It's versatile, it's soft, it's lightweight, it's fairly easy to sculpt and easy to access. But it has some weaknesses that digital modeling can kind of overcome. First off, a lot of difficulty for me, at least when I'm sculpting, is getting things symmetrical. It's kind of hard to get everything lining up on both sides, and when you're patterning everything and you start realizing that things aren't quite lining up, then you have to kind of fix it, and it can be a little bit annoying. But 3D modeling, you can make things symmetrical perfectly every time. And second, iterations. Say you don't like how a head turned out. It's a lot of work to kind of undo and redo and add new layers and cut things away or just completely restart. It's kind of wasteful in the process. But with 3D modeling, we can iterate, we can change, we can look around it in three-dimensional space and see what that shapes look like from different angles and really get an understanding of how those pieces go together. So it gives us a lot of options. Some of my favorite stuff lately has been exploring not only modeling in 3D, but modeling on top of existing models in 3D, using things like an iPhone or professional or semi-professional 3D scanners. An example of this is the current project I'm working on is a character from Hell of a Boss called Vortex. And I modeled this on top of a scan of my own head. So I know that the inside is going to fit me pretty well. Another example, one of my favorite ways to use 3D scanning is on feet. This is a foot for that same project that I modeled on top of a shoe so that I have a perfect shape to make it work. You can see there that it's just going to fit in perfectly. I'm not going to have to do a whole lot of work to make things match up. I can just glue these things together with like some E6000, and it's going to be a pretty reliable shoe for this cosplay. One of the most difficult things is turning those three-dimensional models into physical reality. And there's a lot of ways to do it, but the one I want to focus on today is 3D printing with a material called TPU. Now, most people, when you think of 3D printing, you think of printing with PLA, which is a hard plastic. It's what I made these out of. It's hard. It comes in a lot of varieties of colors and textures, and you can do some really cool stuff with it. But it's hard, it's rigid. It doesn't really make a lot of good parts well if you're wanting things that are soft, if you want things that are flexible. That's where TPU comes in. TPU is a soft, flexible material. When it prints, it retains that property depending on the settings that you're using. It's pretty fascinating because I am able to then print something like this foot that has a similar flex to the foam that I had been carving with before, but I can make it perfectly symmetrical every time. I can make it soft, lightweight. I can make it breathable because you notice that the printing settings here have it pretty open celled. So it has a lot of really interesting properties that make it really exciting to use for fursuit making and cosplay. So when I was looking at using TPU for printing for my personal projects, I was kind of overwhelmed by the amount of different varieties there were, the different settings, things like that. And I decided I wanted to try multiple versions of it out and see what I thought was best for me. I want to start off talking about the test that I made. I had two different materials. First, I did a kind of a square shape, 1 inch by 1 inch by about 3 inches that kind of tapers off at a wedge shape at the end here. The reason why I decided to go with that shape is it's a good shape that I don't think much of my printing will be much thicker than 1 inch when I'm making it ideally. So I can see how springy it is, how soft it is, and then also how much it bends and changes shape based on how thin the material is. And second up is a string tower test. So I made this test so it has outer walls, so I can kind of feel the springiness of that, something with outer walls as well. But also it was a chance for me to be able to see exactly how the stringiness of this has an impact on what you're working on. So different filaments have different amounts of stringiness. Sometimes that might be a deal breaker for you. If we're working as an inner layer, it's not as big of a deal. You can deal with this with a heat gun or a hot knife or even just some scissors. But it's something you want to keep in mind as you're working on your project is how stringy is it going to be? And is that going to be a problem? You'll notice in my printing test here, there's a lot of stringiness that happened. I don't think this is a problem whatsoever, but it sure doesn't look great. If this was going to be on the outside of something, I might need to change this, but I honestly don't think it's too big of a problem for an interior shape like this where I know I'm going to be gluing fur or other materials over the top of it. All right, so in this test, I tested 4 different filaments. First up was the inland TPU. The inland TPU comes in at $25 a kilogram. It's what I use to make these 2 things that I've shown you so far. It's the cheapest per kilogram of all the filaments I used, and pretty decent results came from it. But it was one of the slowest. Up second is the Polymaker Polyflex TPU. This was one of the 2 that I bought that had a high flow rating, which means they printed a lot faster. Polymakers comes in at about $50 a kilogram, whereas Bambu's TPU 95 high flow came in at about $42. And last but not least is the one that I was kind of the most excited about, and I think I still am, is a Very Assure by ColorFabb. And this is unique because unlike the others, this actually changes its state of foaminess based on the temperature pumped through the machine. So it's something to keep in mind when you're using this one is you can come up with some different material textures and feels, and I kind of love how it turned out. All right, so first up, we have the Inland TPU. This is the most generic of the TPU. This was purchased at a micro center in Southern California. It's $25 a kilogram. It's flexible, it's soft, it's kind of good. Honestly, for the price point, if you're wanting the cheapest option here, I can't complain too much about it. It is slow though. The first test I did with each of these prints on the wedge shape was done with default settings. So these were I scoured the website and tried to find everything that I would default it to, or what the printer already had saved as its default settings. So for the Inland TPU, this print speed started at 38 millimeters a second. I printed this at 230 degrees, and for the basic tests, I used a 15% infill. And honestly, this test feels pretty good. It's soft, it's squishy, it feels nice in the hand. It's a good foam replacement. This and a lot of the other generic TPUs have a very plasticky feel, a little bit tougher to glue things to, so that's something to keep in mind. You might need to clean surfaces a little bit more or take your time with hot glue. Up next, I did a test with something a little bit more, a little bit slower, so 25% speed. And what I noticed a lot with the TPUs is the slower you do it, the more rigid it is. The 4th test was at a 50 speed, so slightly faster than the generic test. And then the 5th test I tested at much faster. You can actually see how squishy and soft the bottom is. I think this is way faster than its 50 millimeters a second max speed recommendation. Honestly, like, I wouldn't use it anymore because it's at 100 millimeters a second. It feels weak. It's not binding to itself as much as it should be. So sticking to the max recommendation about 50 is probably a good idea. Up next, I did a test of the different infill percentages with the basic starting settings, or a setting that I felt like was my favorite of the other tests. So this one started with a 10% infill. It becomes a lot softer, a lot squishier. If you need something with a bit of a bounce to it, that could be a great thing. This is the 15%, basically a copy of what we started with. Pretty rigid, but not too bad. And then we have the 20% and the 25%. And you can see everything gets a little bit more rigid as it goes along. And then last but not least is the string tower test. So for this one, you'll notice that it was super stringy until it got towards the top. And at the top, you can see a heat map on the Google Doc of when it gets to the top, it's going a little bit slower. When it was going a little bit slower, it didn't have any of the stringing issues. So something to keep in mind is going slower will probably be less stringy, but there's some other settings you can play with, like retraction, distance, that allow you to get rid of some of that. But the overall feel of this one, I kind of love how it felt. The TPU is pretty good. And like I said, as far as a budget option goes, I think it's pretty solid. Another thing of note that you might or might not like, I honestly, the cardboard rolls tend to have more problems with them. So one of the issues with TPU is that it is soft. And if this roll gets caught, the filament can get wedged in between other parts, other lines of it in the spool. And if it does that, it locks up and that print can fail. So I definitely had the most frustration with the Polymaker in this process. But cardboard rolls can sometimes not, if you drop it, if it's got a bump on it, depending on how you're unwinding it, it can be problematic. So I tend to not like them. I have a bunch of extra spools that I'll respool if I need to, but it's kind of frustrating to use, though I do understand that cardboard is a bit better for the environment than the plastic rolls are. So that's just a little side note. Up next is the Polyflex TPU. It is a Shore 95 high flow TPU. And what separates the high flow from the others is just how much faster you can print it, which is pretty great when you're doing big parts like that. Polymakers, I used all of the site's settings to start with. It is one of the most expensive of the TPUs at $50 a kilogram, but the results are okay. It feels like the most rigid and plasticky of the filaments. And in that sense, I kind of didn't like it that much. You can see how much more rigid it is at factory settings. This is the same 15% infill. It's just hard to squish, and it just feels very plasticky. As I slowed down the speed, it definitely made it harder. And then as I sped it back up again, it honestly didn't change it that much. I noticed that it tends to, this one tended to just stay rigid pretty much no matter what. It's a little bit softer than the base one, but not a whole lot. You can see there. Now, decreasing the infill, of course, made it a bit more soft, which is kind of nice. It means that you could use a little bit less as you're printing, but ultimately, I don't know if I prefer it with that. And then a couple other tests, how much more rigid this is compared to the inland is pretty impressive. So if you're looking for something a little bit more rigid at a $50 price point, I think it works pretty well. It also didn't do too bad with stringing. You notice that as it slowed down, it strung less, but it wasn't near as bad as the inland at stringing. Overall, I thought it was okay. It's a lot more rigid. It definitely was I think my least favorite of all of the filaments that I tested on this test, but I think it could have its purposes if you're looking for something a bit harder. Up next is the Bambu TPU 95A high flow. This is another high flowing TPU, but this one goes a little bit faster. The max speed recommended for this one is they actually say less than 200 millimeters a second. So keep that in mind. It's definitely the fastest one I tested, and it was consistently good when I was doing that. I also really love the feel on this one. This one comes in at $42, just as an FYI. It feels very soft. It feels like the inland, a little bit more firm, but it went, in the default testing, it went at about 106, so pretty fast. It only took about 27 minutes to print this, 20 minutes without warm-ups. But this one went all the way up to, I went all the way up to a 200 speed. So 200 is pretty soft. It actually feels really good. I like it a lot more than I think I like the Inland, but they're comparable, really close to each other in their feel. I think the Bambu has a little bit more give, but it's being done at 200. After the warm-up, this is a 13-minute print as opposed to this one, which was over 30 minutes. So there's some pretty magical things that can happen with the high flow TPU. And it kind of won me over if you can't tell already. And then last but not least, there is the tests of different infill percentages. The three I kind of liked, this is the 10% infill. I kind of like the feel of it. It feels really soft and squishy. Honestly, I think what I would do in the future if I was going to be using this filament more, which I think I will be, I want to run it at about 13%. I think a little bit more firm than this one, a little bit less firm than this one would be a perfect point for me. So, and then as we go into the higher infill percentages, you see it still has a good movement to it, good shape. I could see something like this being the infill for ears and then a smoother outer wall being the outside of it so that you have a nice smooth surface to glue things like the inner ear where you want it as clean as possible. I could see these higher percentage of infill working really well for that. And the string tower test was also really cool on this one. You'll notice that it only started stringing when it started slowing down. So at the top, it got a little bit wonky, but that's when it was going the absolute slowest. I honestly like it. It feels pretty good. It's soft on the outside, much softer than either of the two other tests on the string tower felt. And it has significantly less stringing than any other ones here we tested. All right, last but not least is the VariAssure by ColorFabb. Now, this is definitely the most unique of the filaments that I tested, and I honestly really liked it. It is also the most expensive at about $50 for a 700 gram spool. It's also imported, which adds another $10 to $20 on top of that. So I think I paid around $70, $75 per spool of this, and I bought 2 of them. That being said, it's got some unique features. Its name kind of hints to that. It's called VariAssure, and Shore has to do with the hardness of a filament of a thing. These other ones were running at 95 is what they say. This one has a VariAssure that gives it a huge range of softness to hardness depending on the temperature you used in extrusion. At the lower temperatures at 190, it acts almost identical to the other filaments that I've used. But when I heat it up, it adds air to the mix, it foams the material up, and it becomes much more like a foam that we are already using for crafting with. So I absolutely loved it and the potential that this has, and I can't wait to show you a little bit more about it. One of the weakest parts about this, besides the cost, is the speed. This filament requires a slow speed, slower than any of these other ones. The default settings that they recommend are 20 to 30. At 30, it prints super well. It is the softest of all of these by far, but not too soft that it's unusable. I think it's still pretty good. If I speed it up to 50, it definitely gets softer. It's on the cusp of being too fast for it, but it's definitely still a usable speed. But when I tested it up to 100, you'll notice that it just completely failed. So it is much more sensitive to speed than the rest of these filaments are. When I increased the amount or decreased the infill, it made it much softer, just like these other ones. But it's still, even in the hardest ones, even in the 25%, it's softer than any of the others that I tested today. And then finally, it is also the most stringy. Like, it is just super stringy the whole way through, no matter the speed done. But it still remains pretty cool because it is definitely the softest. It's definitely the most foam-like. Honestly, both of these remind me a lot of like smooth-on casting foam. They have that kind of texture, that give. There's kind of a shell on the outside that's smooth. But ultimately, like, that's what it feels like a lot to me, and I kind of like that feel because I've done a lot of casting like that in the past. But my favorite thing here by far is once you crank the heat on the VariAssure to like 250, you can create this material that is just super foamy and soft. Like it just feels like foam. It is amazing. I absolutely love how this feels. And you can even see the difference between the two of these, how shiny this is versus this one. And that's because there's air bubbles in the filament as it extrudes, as it creates it a much more foamy material. In fact, something you have to do in order to make this work is you decrease the amount of flow rate on this to about 65%. That flow rate, it allows it to blow up a bit more, which is interesting because if you're printing less material and getting a little bit more out of it, you're honestly getting a little bit better of a deal than the $70 a roll that it seems like for this size. So I think it's a pretty cool material for that. As I printed it a little bit faster, I felt like I still got a similar result. It didn't feel too much different. It's definitely slightly softer on the new one, or on the 50 as opposed to the 30. But I think it still would be a fine print to use as a finished product. But because of the price, I would recommend keeping it to that 30% or 30 millimeters a second speed. And finally, there's the different infill percentages. They all remain similar in how all the other ones have been. It gets more rigid as it goes. But like, as I squeeze some of these other ones, you kind of feel a sharpness to them. They're like pointy and rough, but with the foam, it doesn't have that. It is foam, it is soft. It doesn't have that like sharpness that some of these other ones have, which is kind of what makes me really excited about using this in the future. And then the string tower test, obviously, this thing strang like crazy. Like it looks pretty bad, but these pieces can be ripped off and removed fairly easily. I've done a few of them, and even some scissors can get rid of some of that. So it's something to keep in mind that even though it looks not the greatest, man, the texture on this is great. Like I said before, it feels like cast foam. It's got a springiness, bounciness to it. It feels really good in the hands, and it feels like I could glue really easily to this material. I actually did a print in this. This is a claw for a husk cause plate. I had made these originally out of PLA that we sanded and smoothed, and the client got them perfect, and they look great, but they're a bit rigid and sharp. Whereas these ones, they look pretty darn smooth for being foam filament, and they're also incredibly flexible. They collapse when you push the end on it. They're not going to have any issues with being too sharp like the other ones had the potential of being. So really fascinating as far as the use of these can be. I think that these have a lot of potential in the future. And it's honestly one of my favorite things I've worked with so far in 3D printing. All right, so that is pretty much it. I've went through a bunch of different filaments here for you to try to see what I liked and didn't. Hopefully you'll be able to get something from this in the future as well. My definite favorites were the Bambu Lab High Flow TPU and the VariAssure by ColorFabb. They definitely had my favorite amount of performance, unique characteristics, things that set them apart. And a close third was the Inland TPU as far as a budget option. So if you're looking for a TPU to play with, those are my recommendations. If you just want to learn and try new things, the Inland is a great one to start with. But man, the Bambu Lab one works pretty darn well using factory settings. And I'm pretty sure you could get it going a bit faster than expected. But the real breakout winner for me and its uniqueness was the VariAssure, because man, being able to create things that are really foam and not like plastic that's squishy is such a cool feature that other things just can't match quite yet. And with that, I am finished. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you learned a lot, because I learned a lot making this. Please check out the worksheet below to see the different details on the specific experiments, and know that I'm probably going to be working on it and changing it. It's a living document. I'd like to do some more tests on stringing and other things related to TPU as I get more projects that use them. I would like to do more videos in the future. I have ideas of doing tutorials for Nomad sculpts. I would like to do some work on casting and how you use casting in cosplay and fursuit making, and ways to integrate 3D modeling with that. But I'm open to other ideas as well, so if there's something you would like to see done, feel free to put it in the comments below. If you'd like to support me, feel free to like the video or subscribe. If you want to support a little bit more, I do have a Patreon, and these videos and things will go up a little bit earlier when I finish them. They'll go up there first. So thank you again for joining me today in the first video of the Fuzz Academy. I hope you have a great day. Bye.